On the morning of June 4th, 1989, the world woke up to the news that in Beijing, China, thousands of people had been killed and thousands more wounded in a massacre at Tiananmen Square. Most of the victims were students who had demonstrated for weeks against the communist dictators who ruled China. Such a public protest was almost unheard of in China's tightly controlled society. The government's reaction, however, was not.
Now people are running away from the gunfire, from the advancing troops, assuming they are advancing. I guess they are. There are students running behind them, throwing rocks, picking up debris from the concrete on the square and hurling it at the soldiers. But again, the soldiers have not yet broken ranks.
The violence was indiscriminate. Foreign journalists, as well as ordinary Chinese, were swept up in the crackdown.
We're trying to move back and move away.
The man who backed the massacre was Deng Xiaoping, China's paramount leader. His patience with the brief flowering of democracy had run out.
I hadn't expected such naked force as I was seeing on the outskirts of Tiananmen Square. There was something unbelievable about it.
Ross Terrell, a legendary China scholar, says that to understand what happened to the demonstrators that night, you need to understand Deng and his handling of past demonstrators. The communists who brooked no political protest of any kind, Deng had crushed Buddhist protesters in Tibet earlier in 1989.
That protest in Lhasa in Tibet 3 months before Tiananmen was put down in a very brutal fashion by shooting in the streets. Maybe we should have realized that if he felt his power was threatened, he'd do it in Beijing as he had done it in Lhasa 3 months before.
Deng's thinking was shaped by his times, the tumultuous 50s and 60s in China. He rose to power by becoming a top deputy in Mao Zedong's regime.
Deng was in the second tier of leadership. There was Mao and several senior colleagues, and then Deng was right in the second tier. He was a core element in the leadership. He was one of the right arms of Mao.
As Mao aged, the jockeying to succeed him inside the Communist Party became intense. On the one hand, with the so-called leftists, led by Mao's wife, Jiang Qing. On the other hand, Deng and the so-called rightists. The struggle became public when Deng, as deputy prime minister, was blamed for a series of anti-government protests following the death of then-Premier Zhou Enlai. Protests that were unheard of in the repressive China of Mao Zedong.
The radicals around Mao told Mao Deng is behind this. Deng has done this demonstration. And they convinced Mao that Deng was really against him. Mao ordered that Deng be purged from power, so he was demoted.
The theme in the official press and at these meetings and rallies is consistent. Support the party and Chairman Mao, denounce Deng and his so-called capitalist policies. The narrator of this film charged at one point that Monday's violence proved Deng was the representative of the capitalist element within the party.
But if nothing else, Deng had proved himself a tough survivor in the ideological wars that buffeted China during Mao's years. That would become evident in the aftermath of Mao's death on September 9th, 1976.
At the end of Mao's life, there were two forces vying for power. There was a radical group around Mao's wife, and then there was a group of old-line officials who were supporters of Deng.
Mao did not want to hand over power either to his wife or to Deng, so as a result, a virtual unknown named Hua Guofeng emerged as Mao's hand-picked successor.
Hua was a man from nowhere who didn't have any real support. And when Mao passed away, this guy in the middle had to decide which way to go. He sided with the conservatives, if you will, the old-line cadres.
Deng emerged victorious only 3 weeks after Mao's death, when Jiang Qing and 3 of her cohorts, collectively known as the Gang of Four, were arrested for trying to seize power.
Huge crowds paraded through the streets of 3 big Chinese cities again today, cheering Hua and condemning Mao's widow and 3 other so-called radical leaders as, quote, something filthy and contemptible.
Deng, step by step, became the power behind the throne of Hua Guofeng. It took him 2 years before he pushed Hua out and before the Deng era really began in 1978.
Deng Xiaoping cannot be described in soft adjectives. He's feisty, cocky, tough, decisive. But the word most often used is pragmatic, a communist in pursuit of quick results. His philosophy best summed up in a famous quotation of his that prompted the radicals around Chairman Mao to regard him as an ideological renegade. "I don't care," Deng once said, "if a cat is black or white, so long as it catches mice."
Deng launched a series of reforms in the late 1970s and early 80s that introduced a market economy into China. And those reforms transformed China.
Deng Xiaoping came into office with the statement that if you're going to build a new kind of modern socialist economy, you have to rely not on regimentation and political propaganda so much as on giving the people benefits year by year.
Is this a great change as far as you're concerned? You've been here, of course, for 35 years. But is this a big, big change?
It's a tremendous change, Mike, because for years the whole stress of the official propaganda was it's wrong to go after a radio, it's wrong to think of nothing but a bicycle or pretty clothes or something. That's bourgeois, that's individualist. And individualist was a bad word. Now they're being told it's right, go out and work for it. You want good things, work for them, you'll get them.
In 1986, in a rare television interview, I asked Deng Xiaoping whether China would ever go back to the days before his economic reforms.
There will be no turning back. If the current policy is altered, the standard of living of the people will definitely come down. So long as the people think the existing policy is correct, whoever wants to change it will be brought down.
You are the boss. You are number one in China. How long do you intend to continue to be number one, the principal advisor, the man who says, whose word is law here in China?
I am all for doing away with life tenure and putting in its place a retirement system. Personally, I would like to retire early. However, this is a rather difficult decision. It is very hard to persuade the party's rank and file and our people to accept.
While Deng did change China's economy, the same could not be said for China's politics.
Deng thought that you could separate economic and political reforms. He believed that you could give people a certain amount of economic freedom and you didn't have to give them political freedom to go with it.
What Deng didn't realize was that political and economic freedom in the West are frequently intertwined. So when he agreed to normalize relations with the United States in 1979, he didn't realize he was not only throwing China's doors open to America's markets, but to its political ideas as well.
So by 1989, the Chinese knew what was going on in Taiwan, in America and Japan, and they could compare their life. And so that was an achievement of Deng to make that possible. At the same time, it produced in China restlessness.
That restlessness became evident in April of 1989 when Chinese students took to the streets of Tiananmen Square in memory of another communist leader whom they believed was sympathetic to them.
At the Monument to Revolutionary Heroes in Tiananmen Square, some of the demonstrators held up a portrait of Hu Yaobang, who died of heart failure last Saturday. Hu was once the number 2 man in China, head of the Communist Party, and heir apparent to Supreme Leader Deng Xiaoping.
Probably the most popular leader in the Chinese Communist Party among the students and intellectuals in China was this man named Hu Yaobang.
Deng Xiaoping had removed Hu Yaobang 2 years earlier because he believed he was too soft on the student demonstrators.
When the students went to demonstrate about Hu Yaobang, the central leadership responded very rigidly. We've already decided how Hu Yaobang's funeral is going to be handled. We're not allowing people like you to get involved. So that outraged the students, that kind of strict response.
And as the leaders came out of the funeral, the students were already in Tiananmen Square saying, "Talk to us," and also some of them saying, "Down with dictatorship."
It was one of the biggest demonstrations anyone could recall in the Chinese capital.
What started as a manifestation of sorrow at the death of a reformist leader has turned increasingly political, with protesters demanding, among other things, freedom of speech and freedom of the press.
For the Chinese leadership, the student demonstrations in the spring of 1989 could not have come at a worse time. On May 15th, Soviet President Gorbachev would be arriving in Beijing to mend relations between the two communist powers, relations that had been in tatters for more than 30 years. Yet if the demonstrators had their way, the historic summit conference would be overshadowed by the protest in Tiananmen Square. What is worse, on the eve of Gorbachev's visit, the demonstrators added a new tactic to their defiant struggle, a hunger strike.
The hunger strikers marched into the city, supported by thousands of their schoolmates. Their banners bore dramatic slogans such as, "It's great to live, but die with honor."
The hunger strikers were more militant, and they were joined by students from other parts of China who'd taken a few days, in some cases a few weeks, to get there.
Many students even wrote letters of farewell to their parents.
We prefer dying to dictatorship.
The language of a hunger strike as such is kind of confrontational. It's a threat on the part of the hunger strikers that we may die, and they played the symbolism for all that it was worth.
The hunger strikers marched into Tiananmen Square, and they came to stay, to the dismay of authorities, because that is where a military welcome for President Gorbachev was scheduled. Dan Rather was in Beijing to cover Gorbachev's trip.
The summit was used by the students as a rally point, a focal point, if you will, and I believe it to be true, who can prove it, that among their considerations was one that said a larger proportion of the international press will be here to cover the summit than would normally be here, so this is a good time for us to do this.
And so nearly 2,000 hunger strikers and their supporters stayed in Tiananmen Square all that night. At dawn on Sunday, May 14th, still more arrived, pledging that the protest would go on despite Gorbachev's arrival the next day.
Mr. Gorbachev come here and we welcome him, but we don't give up our strike.
The authorities offered a concession, a meeting with government officials. A brief clip was shown on national television. The students came out angry. The meeting, they said, was a fake, meaningless talk from officials who have no real power. The demonstrators are demanding talks with high-level communist leaders and chanting live coverage because of distorted reports in the state-run media.
About the only thing high-level authorities were talking about was that Tiananmen Square would be cleared of pedestrians before Gorbachev showed up. But the demonstrators stayed put.
Why were the students allowed to continue? Mainly because the Secretary General of the Communist Party, Mr. Zhao Ziyang, was sympathetic to them. That helped their cause. Gorbachev's visit also helped their cause.
And so the demonstrators were still in Tiananmen Square on Monday, May 15th, when Gorbachev arrived. But he was not welcomed in the square as planned. Instead, at the last minute, Chinese leaders limited the welcoming ceremonies to quick hellos at the airport, canceling more elaborate fanfare, including a stop in Tiananmen Square.
And so Gorbachev accepted the stiff greetings of Chinese communist leaders on the airport tarmac, while those same leaders were being denounced in the square. Getting to the center of the square means passing through an ocean of students, bicycles, banners, loudspeakers, slogan chanting, singing, and applause. The mood is serious but not angry. Determination, not rage, is on the faces and in the voices. They defied a government order to be out of the square by the time Gorbachev arrived, and no one seemed afraid.
While the students continued to occupy the square, Gorbachev spoke at a banquet that night. But his speech was overshadowed by the presence of the demonstrators outside, and the Chinese government seemed embarrassed, unsure of what to do about the demonstrators.
There was debate in the leadership about how to handle the students. Hardliners wanted to crack down. Softliners wanted to accept the students' offer for dialogue.
At the time of mid-May, I think they were confused, and Deng Xiaoping was not sure of the unity in his own ranks.
That's because there was a power struggle going on between two of his top deputies, the General Secretary of the Communist Party, Zhao Ziyang, who was sympathetic to the demonstrators, and Premier Li Peng, who wanted to break up the demonstration.
Underscoring the shakiness of China's party leadership, 84-year-old Deng Xiaoping was not even there tonight. He didn't see Gorbachev during the day either. He'll meet him tomorrow, it is said. The fill-in host, President Yang Xiangkun, was non-committal, noting that Chinese-Soviet relations have traveled a tortuous course. Today, he said, we have hope for a new future. Hope that was echoed in Tiananmen Square by a young hunger striker for democracy. He says, I'm touched because my teachers and the principal of my school have come out to support the protest. This means all our pain and difficulties are not in vain. We're going to stick to it, right to the end. What the end will be, and when it will come, no one even tries to guess.
What some of the students said they wanted to achieve through their protests was improvement in their lives, better housing and food, changes in the educational system with more respect for education, and they wanted changes in China's government.
To do it, they have to get the government's attention, so they want the news media to be free to report what they say. A free press can urge educational reforms, can attack corruption, can open up a government the students say is closed. They are doing, they point out, what they have the right to do.
Because according to the Constitution, we have the right of assembly and freedom of speech. Yeah, and sometimes we can go out and strike.
So we want to more young people to become the part of the politics.
Lincoln said the government is by the people, of the people, and for the people. Yeah, that's very right, I think, in China.
The other thing the students talk about is democracy, but they are not calling for the prompt overthrow of the system or for free elections tomorrow.
But in China, we should have our own democracy. And this kind of a democracy should be rooted on our culture.
They know it will not be easy.
Easy or not, the students pressed on with their demonstrations, and on Tuesday, May 16th, the fourth day of the hunger strike, more students crowded into Tiananmen Square, and for the first time, Mikhail Gorbachev appeared to notice.
Addressing the Chinese as comrades, ending a 30-year rift in relations, Gorbachev made an oblique reference to the protests, saying he knows about the difficulties that arise in creating a new social system.
Gorbachev did meet with Deng Xiaoping, but their meeting was overshadowed by what was going on outside, where hundreds of hunger strikers had collapsed and been taken to hospitals.
If this doesn't impress the government, I think this government is really hopeless.
Is it worth dying?
Yeah, absolutely.
Wednesday, May 17th, the fifth day of the hunger strike, and another day in which the demonstrators forced the Chinese leadership to alter Gorbachev's schedule.
The man programmed to be the center of attention was off seeing the Great Wall, as event after event scheduled in Beijing was canceled. Late this afternoon, demonstrators rushed the Great Hall of the People and staged a spontaneous sit-down.
These policemen in green are preventing people from going in, but party officials can't get in or out either. In a sense, the people now control the Great Hall, which is in their name.
For these students, this was not a game. And this wasn't just a spring lark. Their lives were literally on the line, and so were the lives of their families. And so they brought into play any and everything that they thought would help their cause.
Mainly the cameras of the world press that continued to record the impact of the demonstrators on Gorbachev's visit. For example, a scheduled tour of the ancient Forbidden City, adjacent to Tiananmen Square, was also canceled.
The government no longer even pretends to control this area. Back there, beyond that sea of people, under the picture of Mao, Tiananmen Gate,
the gate to the Forbidden City. That's where the Gorbachevs were supposed to go. As you can see, there was no way the government could get them in there.
Thursday, May 18th. Gorbachev concluded his visit to China and flew back to Moscow. But the demonstration did not end.
The heavens cried today, said one Chinese, for a nation's children. These sons and daughters of China, some fasting now for 6 straight days, a few going without food or water, continued their campaign for democracy, refusing to compromise.
Deng Xiaoping is like an emperor. Deng Xiaoping originally said, "We have over 300,000 soldiers. These are just a few students. We don't fear them." Now he refuses to speak with us.
But if Deng Xiaoping himself did not speak directly to the demonstrators in the square, 2 of his top government leaders did make the unprecedented gesture of visiting some of the hunger strikers who had been hospitalized.
These are the pictures that Chinese leaders wanted most to be seen. The secretary of the Communist Party, Zhao Ziyang, and Premier Li Peng displaying their best bedside manner at Union Hospital, ministering to victims of the hunger strike. Certainly the words of compromise were there. Your enthusiasm for democracy is commendable, said Zhao, but then the bottom line. We urge you students to end your hunger strike.
Premier Li Peng brought the same message to a remarkable meeting he held with some of the demonstrators.
Inside the Great Hall of the People, Premier Li Peng met face-to-face with the student leaders of this China rebellion. In an extraordinary broadcast on nationwide TV, the students by turns lectured, interrogated, and scolded their nation's top leaders, including Communist Party leaders. "Do you really run the government for the people?" said one of the strikers. "We expect answers and immediate results," said another. But the talks collapsed after Li Peng said the students should leave the square without preconditions. Tell them to leave the square.
But the students refused, calling instead for his resignation. On Friday, May 19th, the leadership made what would turn out to be one last gesture to compromise. At 5 in the morning, in a move unheard of in China's patriarchal society, Chinese government leaders went to Tiananmen Square and met face-to-face with the demonstrators.
Just a few minutes ago, the Chinese government television just released pictures of this morning's extraordinary visit to this square by the premier of the country, Li Peng, and the Communist Party leader, Zhao Ziyang.
The dialogue wasn't much of a dialogue. 80% of the time Li Peng spoke and the students weren't very happy. When it came Zhao's time to talk to the students, he came to the square and walked around the tents, but he began crying and he said to them, "I have come too late."
He promised them that if they would end their strike, the government would not end its dialogue with them.
At the time of their visit to the demonstrators in Tiananmen Square, Li Peng and Zhao Ziyang were locked in a bitter power struggle inside the communist hierarchy. The very next day, at a top-level meeting, China's maximum leader, Deng Xiaoping, resolved the dispute by throwing his support to Li Peng, the implacable enemy of the students. That critical decision signaled the start of the government's Get Tough policy, as Li Peng now declared martial law and called out the army.
After weeks of government paralysis, while students took over the streets of Beijing and moved their protest into a national movement, soldiers are now massing to move against the protesters camped right here in the center of Beijing.
On May 20th, the scene in Tiananmen Square turned frightening. It began to look as though the Beijing demonstrations would be over within hours. Meantime, to stop more information about the demonstration from reaching the rest of the world, China's leaders pulled the plug on live television broadcasts from China.
This is Dan Rather, CBS News, Beijing, with a special report. And the Foreign Ministry, as well as the Communications Ministry, is insisting that we shut down our broadcast. Final pictures we're showing here are of the what limited violence there have been and considerable chaos in downtown Beijing. These are the last pictures we'll be showing to you through our own facilities, and if we're able to show any more at all, I know not when. This is Dan Rather CBS News, Beijing.
Even though live broadcasts were shut down, the networks were still able to report what was happening in Tiananmen Square.
When night fell and the invasion seemed imminent, student leaders started giving orders. No violence, they said. That's the first priority. If you're beaten, don't beat back.
But the anticipated invasion did not come that night, nor the next night.
The people huddled outside the Great Hall of the People see each dawn as a victory. Another night passed, and we're still here.
And on the second day of martial law, some of the demonstrators began to confront army units. Still, the army did not move against the people.
The army doesn't want to suppress the students, but it must enforce martial law. That's not easy. People Power intercepted this convoy. Troops got an earful from citizens. These guys are marching off to lunch, not war.
By May 23rd, the third day of martial law, the government realized they could not prevent information about the demonstration from getting out. So the Chinese leaders eased their restrictions.
China's government suddenly lifted some of its ban on television transmissions out of Beijing. Some of the first new pictures show the students still encamped, some with the energy to protest, some with just enough to play cards, others with none at all. Tiananmen Square, heart and soul of the revolution.
The students seem to be winning the war. I came to help the students, Han Shuyang says. I'm worried about them, but I'm not afraid of anything else. If the students do win, it will be because of Han and people like her. The city relaxed some today, subways began running, more buses moved, but people like Han still surrounded trucks full of troops here and there. One clash Monday night left some citizens and some soldiers injured. The government called a press conference about that. The government even held a hospital tour to show off its wounded. Still, it has been a very nonviolent confrontation.
The demonstration continued, and by the last week of May, the demonstration had taken on an almost carnival-like vitality.
Tongjimen, comrades, comrades. A professional choral group marches past the square calling the people, and the people come all night long. Vendors, workers, tourists, they come by the thousands. How long will you stay?
I don't know, maybe the whole night.
The budding revolution provides much to see. Biggest attraction, the motorcycle vigilantes that zoom by. They are out patrolling for troops. The freedom even to be gathered here is itself exhilarating, something many Chinese thought they never would experience. Patriotic enthusiasm, this man says. I've got it, so I come.
This buoyant feeling persisted for several days, even though there was tension underlying it. After all, martial law was still in effect, and troops were poised nearby to move in at a moment's notice. And then, on Tuesday, May 30th, the demonstrators ratcheted up their defiance yet another notch.
The dawn's early light reflected off a new symbol of the protest movement, the goddess of democracy.
The 33-foot statue was built by art students out of styrofoam and plaster of Paris, modeled after its famed sister in New York Harbor, the Statue of Liberty.
They hoped it would fire up their movement, and it did. By Tuesday night, Tiananmen Square was full of people looking, admiring. If the students liked their statue, the government clearly didn't. The state-controlled television news quoted a Tiananmen Square management committee as wanting it removed, and an unnamed intellectual as saying it should be gone before Thursday.
But on Wednesday, May 31st, the statue was still there, outraging China's maximum leader.
The goddess of democracy infuriated Deng Xiaoping. They put it right there in the middle of Tiananmen Square. So there was the big picture of Mao, a symbol of collectivism, and there was the goddess looking very much like the Statue of Liberty as a symbol of individualism.
The deadline for removing the statue, Thursday, June the 1st, came and went, and the statue stayed where it was. The next day, Chinese troops started to make their move.
Under cover of darkness, columns of Chinese soldiers advanced on the center of the city from all directions. Thousands of ordinary people poured out of their dwellings in the middle of the night and turned the army back.
The students started to persuade the soldiers that democracy was needed in China. And they did this with some success.
Most of the troops were not carrying weapons. One who was showed that the ammunition clip of his rifle was empty. He shouted, "The army will never shoot the people."
And on June 2nd, even the soldiers who had made it into the city were persuaded by the demonstrators to leave.
The People's Army, surrounded by the people, turned back in its tracks a few hundred yards from Tiananmen Square. "Without fighting, you lost the battle," a civilian shouted to the troops in retreat, unarmed, exhausted, and engaged in what intelligence sources immediately called a huge blunder. Despite reports more troops were waiting out of sight, victory was celebrated on the street and in the square where the demonstrators are still encamped.
But the victory was short-lived. 24 hours later, on Saturday night, June 3rd, the government brought in a different group of soldiers who would not be persuaded to leave, and they started clearing Tiananmen Square.
Now people are running away from the gunfire, from the advancing troops, assuming they are advancing. I guess they are. There are students running behind them, throwing rocks, picking up debris from the concrete on the square and hurling it at the soldiers. But again, the soldiers have not yet broken ranks, nor have they fired tear gas.
Correspondent Richard Roth and cameraman Derek Williams were in the thick of the violence. But since the Chinese had again cut off live transmission, Roth was reporting by cellular phone as it was happening.
You hear that gunfire?
We do hear it.
Okay, we've got to get out of here. They're after Derek now. They're ripping away his camera. And they're coming for us. We're trying to move back and move away. I'll go.
This is a CBS News special report. From CBS News headquarters in New York, here is Bob Schieffer.
And we want to go immediately to Richard Roth in Tiananmen Square. The troops were moving toward him at last report. What's happening, Dick?
This is New York. Does anybody hear us? This is New York. Does anybody hear us?
We have just lost communication with Richard Roth.
Hello, this is New York. Does someone hear us there? Hello, this is New York. Does anybody hear us?
Richard Roth and Derek Williams were taken captive by the soldiers and suffered minor injuries. They were later released. They were lucky.
2 miles west of the square, troops opened fire indiscriminately on a crowd of men, women, and children. People were killed or wounded. An army truck was set ablaze. Each time the gunfire started, people ran only a short distance, then stopped to confront the troops again.
Russ Terrell was in China that night. He rushed to Tiananmen Square to see just what was happening.
The crowd would move closer. The troops would fire. The crowd would then run in the other direction. One woman said to me, looking at me as a foreigner, "Tell the world our government has gone mad."
One of the student leaders of the demonstration, who fled China in fear of reprisal, taped a message a week later describing the massacre. It was read by a translator.
I'm Chai Ling, the chief commander of Tiananmen Square. Students and citizens were being beaten, being hurt. That night, from 8 to 10, the situation got worse. Around us, east and west, Chang'an Avenue had become a river of blood. The executioners were soldiers of the 27th Army. They used tanks and submachine guns and knives. They aimed at those students who had chanted just one slogan and thrown just one rock. They chased them down and shot them. The bodies on Chang'an Avenue were all bleeding profusely. We learned later that some students still had hope in the government and in the soldiers. They thought, at most, that they would be carried away. They were tired and returned to their tents to sleep. Then the tanks made pancakes out of them. Some said that more than 200 students died. Some say that more than 4,000 students had died in the square alone.
No one outside of China followed the terrible events more closely than the thousands of Chinese students in America.
At the Caltech campus in Pasadena, students listened tearfully to phone conversations with relatives in China, their accounts of the bloodshed.
The army is closing into the campus of Beijing University.
A few miles away at the Chinese consulate, more news accounts, more tears, a desperate call for help.
Everybody around the world who believes in democracy, believes in freedom, should now stand up and show their support.
In New York and Louisiana, more anger, more frustration. Meanwhile, at a student gathering in Boston, a phone report from home. A pregnant woman gunned down.
And they just shoot her. I mean, I can't believe they did that. I mean, we should stop this. I mean, everybody should say no, Chinese government, stop this.
But the Chinese government did not stop its horror. The terror continued into the following week, Tuesday, June 6th.
Soldiers again opened fire on civilians who refused to leave the streets and go home. Many Beijing neighborhoods were littered with the burned-out wrecks of military and public transport vehicles. Pro-democracy, pro-reform, pro-freedom protesters firebombed every abandoned vehicle they could find. In an amazing gesture of personal bravery, one lone protester tried to stop a column of advancing tanks. He climbed onto the lead tank, haranguing its captain, to no avail. After the tank captain warned the protester to get off, friends ran onto the avenue and forced him to leave to safety. The tank column then continued on its way.
Despite the continuing killing, civilians resist with sticks and stones and raw courage and rage. Some soldiers have been murdered, equipment destroyed, and there are now credible reports of soldiers who have set their own vehicles on fire and withdrawn in disgust at making war on their own people.
Even so, the killing did not stop.
There has been the continual sound of gunfire here as Beijing and possibly the country sinks deeper into chaos. China's 27th Army holds Tiananmen Square with a force of 160 tanks, plus infantry and other armor.
Despite the clear evidence of carnage and bloodshed in Tiananmen Square on that first weekend in June of 1989, the Chinese government tried to rewrite history during the days following the massacre. Its official version of the events was that a mob of counter-revolutionaries had turned on the People's Army and it had to be put down. But the biggest lie of all was the claim that no one was killed. The world knew otherwise. And from Washington came reports of how extensive the massacre had been.
U.S. intelligence officials now tell us that the number of dead, this is an estimate, in Beijing is 3,000. This is the first time the American government has put a number on the dead, and it is an extremely high one.
President Bush had initially reacted cautiously to the events in Beijing, but he changed his mind when the scenes of brutality turned ugly.
The president today sent a get tough message to the Chinese military. He suspended all U.S. military sales to China, declaring the United States cannot do business as usual.
And I think it's important that the Army know that we want to see restraint, and this is the best way to signal that.
Today, all over the world, people protested and raged and cried. In Bonn, they burned an army uniform. This woman works for the Chinese embassy in Bonn, but she was one who cried. Massacre, the banners read. The army used force. The students used what they had, rocks sometimes swords. In Moscow, a quiet protest. They sang too. In English, one line goes, "A brave new world's in birth." Not today. In Beijing, they cried for the dead. In Roanoke, Virginia, a man cried out for a missing brother.
Washington issued an advisory to Americans in China, advising them to leave, calling the situation grave.
Even before the U.S. Embassy advised its citizens to get out, Beijing airport was filled with anxious Americans trying to flee the city.
I'm afraid. I want to get out.
Kathy Mills cut her vacation short. She arrived in Beijing by train Sunday.
The Chinese seemed really nervous on the train, made us nervous. And when we got off the train, we walked for about 20 minutes and there was a burning body on the ground, a soldier, and everybody was surrounding it.
Wednesday, June 7th, 3 days after the massacre, China's government, for the first time, admitted that people had been killed.
State Council spokesman Yuan Mu told Chinese journalists that soldiers sustained more casualties than civilians. He claimed that on both sides, 300 people died, only 23 of them students.
And still the violence continued. Troops even fired on apartments where Americans lived.
The U.S. ambassador to China ordered families of U.S. officials evacuated after Chinese troops terrorized a diplomatic compound, spraying bullets into apartment buildings that house American and other foreign citizens. Witnesses said more Chinese were killed by gunfire on the streets of Beijing.
While the violence persisted, China's government struggled to put the best face on things.
Official Chinese government television and other propaganda are working hard to create an impression, at least create an impression, that the chaos is subsiding, that the threat of civil war is fading, and that Chinese life is returning to normal under the hardline communist leadership.
One of the first clues as to who's won a war is who's wearing the smiles and who's got the brooms. When the inveterate hardline Prime Minister Li Peng made his smiling and triumphant appearance in the Great Hall of the People and on Chinese television last night, it signaled curtains for the democratic movement. This was just so clearly the man who had prevailed. The soldiers are sweeping up now. They've won the battle. Now they're cleaning the battleground, restoring and redefining normalcy, rounding up many from the ranks of their enemies, students and workers. The truth, as best as we can read it, seems to be that the war is over and the people have lost.
On the surface, at least, the events of those fateful days in Tiananmen Square have had little lasting impact. China escaped economic reprisals for the massacre, in large part because the world's most populous nation had developed into such a powerful trading partner. And in July of 1997, when Britain returned Hong Kong to China, it only underlined China's burgeoning economic strength. Yet while China's leadership has adamantly refused to apologize for the massacre in Tiananmen Square, including President Jiang Zemin's 1997 trip to the United States, there are signs that the first faint breeze of political freedom may be stirring at the local and municipal level. As a new and younger generation takes power in China, the legacy of Tiananmen Square may turn out to be not bloodshed, but a tentative first step toward political freedom. I'm Mike Wallace, and this is the 20th Century.